Lithuania thought the crisis would start with a warning. Instead, it started with a disappearance. Overnight, Chinese customs screens showed every nation on Earth except one. Lithuania's name, its code, its digital identity inside the world's largest trading system was simply gone. Cargo ships carrying Lithuanian goods circled Chinese ports like stranded satellites, unable to dock, unable to be returned, unable to even be recognized. And as the first dairy shipment began rotting at sea, Vilnius faced a realization no European government had imagined possible. China hadn't sanctioned Lithuania. China had erased it. A freighter carrying 20,000 bottles of Lithuanian rum kept its engines in low idle a few kilometers offshore, waiting for clearance that would never arrive. The captain reported no error messages, only a lack of recognition, as if the country of origin had been erased. Another ship carrying 50,000 tons of dairy product retreated into open waters after receiving a denial that offered no reason and no possibility of appeal. The voyage back would doom the shipment. The spoilage risk accumulated with every nautical mile. Lithuanian agricultural officials logged the loss while still searching for diplomatic language strong enough to describe what had happened. European supply chains detected the rupture almost as quickly as the ports. German manufacturers using Lithuanian components asked whether those parts could safely reach China, not because of tariffs or political disputes, but because Chinese customs no longer accepted Lithuanian inputs buried inside assemblies made in other EU states. Continental's risk teams circulated internal guidance warning that any supply chain passing through Lithuania could jeopardize export eligibility to China. This council reached companies that had never participated in politics and never imagined their contracts depended on geopolitical vocabulary. Export tables inside Lithuania recorded the collapse with numerical precision. More than 300 million euros in products shipped to China in 2020 shrank to around 40 million 2 years later. The drop was not a decline but a rupture, a removal of an entire market from an economy built on predictable relationships. Lithuanian firms relying on Chinese equipment discovered an additional layer of vulnerability. Their machines required specialized engineers who could no longer obtain visas. What had once been a procedural request routed through embassies became a permanent deadlock, leaving half-maintained machines waiting for technicians who would never arrive. Workshops slowed, then paused, then entered the bankruptcy system that documented over 300 business failures in the first half of 2023. More than 8,000 jobs evaporated in industries that once looked stable. Towns dependent on factories saw their local economies invert overnight. Grocery stores lost foot traffic. School budgets contracted. Property owners attempted to sell in markets with falling demand. Each effect widened the circle of impact, reaching residents who had never heard of the diplomatic dispute that initiated the shift. All of it occurred while diplomatic architecture crumbled in parallel. Lithuania and China had downgraded relations in late 2021, but few understood how rapidly diplomatic minimalism would become diplomatic absence. Embassies shrank to skeleton staffs. Administrative cables replaced engagement. Then, in May 2025, the last Chinese diplomat in Lithuania left the country and was denied re-entry at Vilnius airport, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the normal execution of visa law. The Chinese embassy became an empty building marked only by a sign and a flag that no one was authorized to remove. Families of Lithuanian citizens claimed to be detained in China faced alleged consequences that statistics could not capture. They contacted ministries for information, but the ministries had nothing to give. Without diplomatic presence, the right to visit detainees or verify legal processes vanished. Parents attempted to speak to their children through intermediaries who had no access. Legal representatives attempted to request updates that were not answered. Every absence of communication created its own pressure, one that Lithuanian officials could not relieve. The roots of the crisis ran back to 2021, when Lithuania permitted the Taiwanese Representative Office to open using the word Taiwanese in its name, rather than the widely adopted Taipei formulation. Lithuanian leaders framed the choice as a principled position. Beijing interpreted it as a violation of the One China principle, and its response unfolded across trade, logistics, visas, and diplomacy, without the need for a single high-profile declaration. The conflict moved through supply chains rather than speeches, through digital systems rather than televised exchanges. Railway corridors absorbed the next shock. In 2020, more than 600 China-Europe freight trains passed through Lithuania, stopping at Vilnius for warehousing before continuing to Klaipėda's port or deeper into Western Europe. After the freeze, China suspended those routes. Lithuania lost around 200 freight flows almost instantly. Rail officials later documented a freight volume decline near 40% in 2022, erasing close to €500 million in revenue. The disappearance reshaped the logistical geography of the Baltic region with a speed comparable only to natural disasters or wartime adjustments. Klaipėda's port felt the shift through cranes that moved but lifted fewer containers. Throughput fell 21% year-on-year, its sharpest decline in nearly a decade. Port managers anticipated temporary turbulence, but the decline became structural as inbound Eurasian cargo redirected to Belarusian and Polish routes. Infrastructure built for continental flows now served regional ones, reducing revenue and relevance simultaneously. By 2024, former Prime Minister Gintautas Paluckas began signaling a willingness to rebuild relations. It was not a reversal of policy, but a recognition that maintaining the freeze was no longer sustainable. The following year, President Gitanas Nausėda and Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis, who had once delivered some of Lithuania's hardest lines toward China, all expressed readiness to restore dialogue. Their public statements represented a political repositioning shaped not by ideology but by the accumulation of operational failures. Beijing did not respond. It offered no acknowledgement, no meetings, no diplomatic openings. Ministries in Vilnius began concluding that Beijing viewed Lithuania's statements as irrelevant without a change to the policy that triggered the crisis. Analysts noted the contradiction at the heart of Lithuania's new posture, offering compromise without altering the underlying position that China considered non-negotiable. Factories felt this contradiction in the most tangible way. Production lines that once depended on Chinese technicians now documented months of unresolved maintenance issues. Agricultural exporters who relied on predictable customs cycles saw their goods spoil in transit. Universities that collaborated with Chinese labs found their memoranda of understanding expiring with no possibility of renewal. Consumer electronics distributors waited for shipments that remained trapped in customs holds tied to the origin of subcomponents. Landsbergis's declaration that Lithuania would give China one last chance reflected a tone shift that no longer resembled strategy. It resembled urgency. His earlier statements carried an air of confidence that Lithuania could shape the terms of confrontation. His new language carried an implicit admission. Silence was shaping the confrontation instead. EU intermediaries attempted to assist. Baltic states explored messaging that might reduce tensions. But without policy change on the Taiwanese representative office, there was no pathway forward. Lithuanian officials had to rely on foreign embassies in Beijing to process visas for their citizens and to facilitate limited communication with Chinese authorities. Outsourcing sovereign functions to third parties created delays and practical limitations that no amount of diplomatic phrasing could resolve. By mid-2025, the crisis no longer resembled a dispute. It resembled a transformation. Lithuania's relationship with China was not frozen. It had been reconfigured into a new state in which channels that once existed no longer held any operational meaning. Exports shrank. Rail connections disappeared. Port flows declined. Visas stalled. Diplomacy evaporated. The absence itself had become the dominant force shaping outcomes. Inside Lithuania's ministries, conversation shifted from how to restore relations to how to operate without them. Officials debated the long-term implications of losing access to China's market while still dependent on European supply chains that relied on Chinese inputs. Political aides who once projected confidence about the resilience of Lithuania's international position acknowledged privately that leverage had never been evenly distributed in this conflict. The emotional point of the crisis emerged in a moment that carried no announcement, only recognition. Ministers understood that even if Lithuania softened its tone, Beijing was no longer listening for tone. A silence that stretches months begins as a response, but becomes a boundary. That boundary now divided two states whose diplomatic vocabulary had ceased to function. Factories slowed further, households recalibrated budgets. Analysts updated forecasts. Politicians edited speeches. The crisis seeped into every decision from retail inventory planning to foreign policy debates in parliament. Silence became a form of pressure that did not need to raise its voice. As autumn neared, the situation reached its starkest form. Lithuania had spent nearly half a year offering signals of compromise. China had delivered none. The Taiwanese representative office kept its sign. Diplomatic channels remained blocked. Technical visas remained inaccessible. Logistics corridors remained rerouted, and the imbalance of leverage had not shifted in Lithuania's favor. The unresolved tension sits in a single fact that no official speech can erase. A country can choose a position, but it cannot choose the consequences once the other side decides to respond through systems rather than statements. Lithuania now lives inside consequences that no ministry can unilaterally reverse. If silence alone has been enough to reshape a national economy, what happens when silence is no longer the tactic, but the foundation of a relationship that used to exist and now exists only as absence? The answer has not appeared, and the waiting has become the outcome. Lithuania waited for China to blink, but the only thing that moved was the cost. Freight routes rerouted permanently, factories hollowed out, diplomats gone, and ships once bound for Asia now drifting toward bankruptcy. And through every lost contract and every unanswered message, one fact kept getting louder. Beijing never needed to threaten Lithuania. It simply removed the country from the places where modern nations survive. Now Europe is watching a silence powerful enough to rewrite borders without touching a single map. And the question hanging over every capital tonight isn't what China does next. It's who disappears the moment they misread the rules. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.